the A-Team, that 80s show, which I found so addictive as a child growing up. I think what it was that was so addictive about it was you were always wondering how that team were going to get themselves out of the sticky situation they'd got themselves into. They'd been holed up in a barn or a warehouse, perhaps like this one. And yet, not a few hours later, with a piece of wire and a tube and maybe some chewing gum, they blasted their way out with a battle-ready tank taking on the enemy. They really were the kings of improvisation, weren't they? Perhaps aside from MacGyver. It made for great TV. The best spontaneity, as someone has said, is rehearsed. The best spontaneity is rehearsed. Preparing ourselves for evangelistic conversations doesn't negate the leading of the Spirit, for we cannot separate His work through the Word which we are called to devote ourselves to. In chapter 3 of his first letter, Peter has already said to us, be prepared to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. And how different things were now for him. He was that seeming wreck of parts in a warehouse at the crucifixion, devastated and shattered by his Lord's death. And worse, torn apart by his own denials. But then his Saviour stood up again and graciously restored him and caused him to spring to powerful, put-together resurrection life, so that he now became a bold defender of truth at risk to his own life each day. These words he spoke to slaves in his letter in chapter 2 verse 19, for this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. He became the epitome of that. E is for everyday readiness. ER, if you like. Emergency response living, intentional, missional, purposeful, however you like to put it. Peter calls on Christians to take on each day, conscious of God and the life and death matters of the gospel. Well, welcome to COVIDSATIONS, a short video series helping equip us with the ABCs of evangelism as we speak and have conversations with our unbelieving friends and family. At a time such as this, how crucial is it? The best spontaneity is rehearsed might come more easily to a military-trained A-team with a B.A. Baracus, a Hannibal, Murdoch and Faceman, especially since this is television and you can make anything happen. But how do we heed the call to always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have? We've seen how important our holy living is, but it's just as important to have Jesus more readily on our lips and a more natural part of our conversations. Jesus, after all, said that what's in our hearts will flow out of our lips. Peter helps us, actually commands us in chapter 1, verse 13. He says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. In other words, a life of everyday readiness is a life with a fully set hope. This command comes after having just reminded us of the glorious grace of new birth into a living hope that we've been given in the work of Jesus for us. Command always follows grace, and in this case it looks forward to grace too. In other words, our resources for obeying this command lie in gospel grace already poured out in the past and held out to us in the future. And so, Peter tells us that this readiness starts with what we do with our minds. Listen again, and I'll read the literal translation. Therefore, girding up your minds, girding up your loins rather, for action, being sober-minded. To gird up your loins sounds strange and maybe even uncomfortable to us, but it describes the actions of Middle Eastern men of the time who wore long robes, and when suddenly needing to spring into action, they would push the long robe into their belt. Think of the father in the parable of the prodigal son running to his son when he saw him returning. Or the soldier at war, tucking away any hindrance, ready to fight the good fight. That second phrase is a little more familiar to us. Be sober-minded. And we know the effect of excessive alcohol on a person. They lose the ability to control their mind, but with that often their tongue and their bodies as well. And so what starts with a sloppy, affected mind results in sloppy, foolish, and often painful consequences, actions, and words. Peter is telling us we need to win the battle in our minds. That's where it starts in the Christian life. And so much like eating and drinking and its effects, it really is all about what you take in, what you feed your mind and your heart with, whether you nourish it with God's truth or numb it with the world's distractions. Peter says in verse 14 of chapter 1, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. Before, you see, we didn't care what we filled our mind with. Now that we know Him who is the truth, we strive to take every thought captive for Him. A fight is on for our minds, and it's one we must take seriously as we recognize God's deadline draws all the nearer. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. So let me bend your ear a bit as we seek to bend and stretch our minds for the sake of the gospel. We need to be ruthless in order to be ready. And so will you be ruthless with what you know you allow to numb your mind? Our world offers so many mind-numbing realities, and we are often too quick to oblige without questioning. Maybe this COVID lockdown is something we can thank God for in this way. It's given us a good temperature check of our minds. What have you filled your mind with in this lockdown time? More Netflix, more series, more frivolous things, more sports, more work, more entertainment, more me time, more man cave solace, more comfort, more entitlement, more sleep, more laziness, more leniency about my sin, more excuses not to pray, more moaning and groaning about my lot. Of course, not all of these things are wrong in and of themselves, but if you're listening more to the world than to the Word, you can be sure we will have nothing to say to our world. And more than that, we will end up looking more like it, without a fixated hope, a hunger for holiness, and a burning concern for others' eternities, which incidentally is just the kind of Christian the devil is looking for. Instead, God says, chapter 5, verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Being swallowed up by the devil doesn't happen in one bite. It's a slow, subtle slide down his gullet when we are careless with our minds. So friends, knowing this, what battle strategies can we put in place that we might be filled to overflowing with God's truth and so engage readily, confidently, and skillfully with unbelievers? How can we knead God's truth into our lives? Well, if I may follow our ABC pattern for this series, let me suggest first that you absorb. In other words, immerse yourself more and more in His goodness, His grace and beauty and truth, both in His world, but supremely in His word. There are no shortcuts. It was said of John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress from prison, if you cut him anywhere, his blood would bleed bibline. We must be like that. Be accountable. Create a hedge of accountability around yourself of Christian friends who can call you out, back you up, and be your sounding board. Give them permission to audit your lifestyle, to comment on your diary, and to challenge you about how you spend your time. Do that for each other. Speak and pray together about what you read in His Word. But also speak and pray and even practice talking together about current day events, news and philosophies that you see and hear and that you're personally confronted with in your life to help you bring Christ into your everyday conversations. And lastly, confront. Confront the world. Don't run from it or its controversies and challenges. Don't run into your comfort bubble or your holy huddle. confront with grace and truth. So often when we become Christians, our circle of non-Christian friendships shrinks. Friends, we must foster relationships with the unbelieving world, that we might have opportunity to share with them the life-saving news. Whether you join a club or even lessen some church activity, especially if you're overcommitted, or wisely accept an invitation from an unbelieving friend to something that won't cause you compromise, then we must do that so that He might be made known. E is for everyday readiness. E is for effort, but it's worth it that hope might blaze forth from you and God may pluck another dying soul from hell.